Hi all, I thought I'd do a quick run through the mechanism of breathing and gas exchange in humans in order to help you succeed on your homework. A brief review of the anatomy of the thoracic cavity or the chest cavity. In the chest cavity, you have two pleural cavities, plural referring to lungs. So there are two cavities where each one of your lungs is situated, so two spaces. Within these cavities are your lungs that are lined by two membranes called pleura. The pleura consist of the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. The parietal pleura is a layer of single layer of epithelial cells that lines the chest cavity itself. So it's like glued to the chest cavity. The visceral pleura is the simple layer of epithelial cells that lines the lung tissue itself. So it's like it has shrink wrapped your lung. Both of these layers of epithelial cells, both of these membranes, produce a lubricant fluid. This lubrication allows the lungs to slide past the chest cavity really smoothly when you're breathing, so there is no rubbing or irritation happening. In addition to lubrication, another purpose for this fluid is to keep the two pleura, the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, within very close contact. Imagine two pieces of saran wrap that are wet, you put them together, they will be pretty stuck. Or even think of putting a wet glass on a very smooth tabletop, it will get stuck, and even though the glass will slide every which direction really easily, if you try to lift it up, there will be some resistance. Of course, then you just tilt the glass to lift it. And this is very important because as your chest expands during breathing, you want to be able to keep the lung attached to the wall of the chest instead of being independent of that chest. So from this diagram, combining the information we've learned in lecture and in lab, make sure you're familiar with lung. The parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, the diaphragm, okay, the thin muscle that forms the bottom part of your thoracic cavity, your ribs, rib cage consists of all your little ribs, your sternum, and sternum is your breastbone that is formed of three fused bones, and we will call that good for this slide. Now let's review a few simple laws of physics that have to do with gases. Gases will take up whatever space is available to them because the molecules within the gas are moving independently of one another. There are inherent energies causing them to bounce into everything in sight, including other molecules. In a sealed container, the pressure exerted by the gas molecules is due to the molecules bouncing against the container walls. So with constant temperature, the pressure within this container is inversely proportional to the volume of the container. So for example, if you go ahead and decrease the volume, okay, like you can see in this diagram on the right, the less space there is, smaller volume, means the particles are bouncing into the walls of the container much more frequently, and this increases the pressure. So if you decrease the volume by 2, basically you half the volume, then you're increasing the pressure by 2. You're doubling the volume. Blah. Halving the volume will double the pressure. This is Boyle's law. In addition, it's important to remember that air always flows from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Within this balloon, if you have a leak, particles, the gas particles within the balloon will leak out of the balloon into the surrounding air. Kind of like diffusion, particles always move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration, and that makes sense here. So if we look at the functionality of your chest cavity muscles when you're breathing, we'll be able to apply these laws of physics relative to gases that we've just talked about. When you inhale, your diaphragm contracts, and as it contracts, it moves down. So it moves lower. When it moves lower, it pulls the chest cavity down, therefore increasing the space, the volume within your chest cavity. In addition to that, the way that your ribs are connected to your vertebrae, the bones of your spine, when you inhale, the rib cage moves up like these arrows are showing, and as they move up, the volume of your chest increases. So both moving the diaphragm down or moving your rib cage up increases the volume within your chest cavity. When the volume increases, what happens to the pressure inside of that space? I hope you said that the pressure of the gases inside of the space will decrease. So now this pressure within the chest cavity is lower than the pressure outside in the atmosphere. And this will cause air to be drawn into the lungs because air moves from an area of higher pressure, in this case the outside of your body, to an area of lower pressure, which is inside of your expanded lungs. When you exhale, your diaphragm relaxes, so it moves up, pushing your lungs up, and your ribs relax and go down. That also pulls the lungs down. All in all, relaxation causes your thoracic cavity, your chest cavity, to become smaller. Lower volume means higher pressure, and in this case, the pressure will now be higher inside of your lungs than it is outside of your body in the atmosphere. Again, air will move from an area of higher pressure in your lungs to an area of lower pressure outside, and so that's how the air gets pushed out during exhalation. The partial pressures of gases in the atmosphere at sea level under normal conditions are represented here. The overall air pressure of the atmosphere at sea level is 760 millimeters mercury. And the relationship between the atmospheric pressure and the interpulmonary pressure, or the pressure inside of your lungs, will determine the direction of airflow, just as we discussed previously. This air pressure, the atmospheric pressure, is the total of partial pressures of all of the gases that make up the atmosphere, which is mostly nitrogen, but what we're interested in here is oxygen. If the air is moist, there will also be a tiny fraction of water vapor added to this equation. So at calm breathing, the difference between the pressure of the atmosphere and the pressure inside your lungs is actually quite small. So on inhalation, your lungs will expand, and this expansion causes the pressure inside of your lungs to be 759 millimeters. Notice that this is only 1 millimeter mercury lower than the atmospheric pressure. However, that is absolutely enough to draw sufficient amount of air from the outside into your lungs. And when you exhale, lungs recoil and the pressure inside of your lungs becomes 761 millimeters, which is just 1 millimeter mercury higher than the atmospheric pressure. But again, that is enough to draw air out. If you're not exercising or doing anything strenuous and you're not smoking, this small of a pressure difference between your lungs and the atmosphere is enough for inhalation and exhalation. But when a trained athlete breathes at maximum capacity during exercising, the pressure difference can reach as much as 30 millimeters during inhalation. So there's definitely a range there. Each blood cell has about 800 million molecules of hemoglobin. Each hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen, can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. And if you multiply the amount of hemoglobin and how much oxygen can be carried, we find out that each red blood cell can carry about 1 billion of oxygen molecule. The way that it carries the oxygen throughout your blood, releases it, and then regains it again as the red blood cells flow in the capillaries near the alveoli of your lungs, is due to cooperative binding and cooperative release. And that means that when one molecule of oxygen binds to a hemoglobin, this changes the shape of the protein just enough to increase the affinity of the next oxygen molecule to bind to that same hemoglobin. So that means after one molecule of oxygen binds, it makes it easier and faster for another and then another and another oxygen molecule to bind. And the same goes for release of oxygen. Once one is released, that makes it easier for the next and the next and the next molecule of oxygen to be released. This is the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve, and it represents the percent of hemoglobin within your red blood cell that is saturated depending on the partial pressure of oxygen within your lungs. At equilibrium, oxygen will bind to heme at the same rate that another oxygen molecule is being released. But if the partial pressure of oxygen increases, more oxygen will bind to the hemoglobin and fewer will be released. Once the first oxygen binds, the slope rises rapidly until the levels near 100% saturation. While the slope is steep, a very small change in partial pressure of oxygen results in a large change in the amount of oxygen that's bound to the hemoglobin. And also, the same goes if we were talking about the release. A very small change in partial pressure will cause a large amount of release. Hemoglobin will be 90% saturated if it's exposed to alveolar pressure of about 60. Not a super straight line, but it's close to 90 here. So that means that near normal oxygen transport can continue even when oxygen content of the alveolar air decreases below the normal amount of about 100. This is very good for us, because without this ability you could not survive at high altitudes at all. Here are some factors that will shift the curve to the right, meaning allow a tighter binding of oxygen. That's decrease of pH of your blood, increase in carbon dioxide, increase in 2,3-DPG, which is a byproduct of the fermentation that happens in red blood cells, or increase in temperature. Carbon monoxide increase will move the curve, shift the curve to the left, and that means it will decrease the rate of oxygen release. And that means that if there is a carbon monoxide that has bound to your hemoglobin, it will still allow oxygen to bind to hemoglobin, but it will hold on to that the hemoglobin will hold on to that carbon monoxide and oxygen really tightly and not release it anywhere in the tissues. So that is why carbon monoxide poisoning is very dangerous, because oxygen even if it's stuck to the hemoglobin, cannot be released and oxygenate the tissues. And also, in fetuses, the curve shifts to the left, but that is not what we're talking about here. So as the chest cavity here increases in volume, air will flow in to an area of lower pressure inside of your lungs. And the air now at the tips here in the alveoli will diffuse through the moistened epithelial cells of the alveoli and into the red blood cells. In reality, there's a very small space that the oxygen needs to diffuse to. It is only 2 epithelial cells thick, and they're short epithelial cells. So oxygen can diffuse quite well into the plasma, and then from plasma it will diffuse into the red blood cells. As these red blood cells travel around the body, when they encounter neighboring tissues that have a lower pressure of oxygen, the oxygen will be released from the red blood cells in a cooperative manner. Like I talked about before, when one is released, it makes it easier for the rest to get released, and will diffuse through the plasma and through the endothelium, which is the epithelial cells here, and into the surrounding tissues. And inversely, carbon dioxide will move to an area of lower carbon dioxide partial pressure and thus become saturated in the plasma or gets bound to the hemoglobin, or gets bound inside, not the hemoglobin, gets bound inside the red blood cells and will be moved to the lungs. And help you be a healthy, happy, active, non-smoking person. I hope that helped you guys. Please email me if you have any questions. Good luck studying, and I'll see you on Monday.